A German pilot had an American bomber locked in his sights. The target hung in front of him like a training exercise. Crippled, barely flying, one engine dead, the tail section torn apart, controls barely responding, no fighter escort, no defensive fire, no way out. One pull of the trigger, and it was over. Franz Stigler was among the finest aces in the Luftwaffe. By December 1943, he had 29 confirmed aerial victories. One more, and he would receive the Knight's Cross, the highest military decoration in Germany, the honor that pilots spent years and their lives trying to earn. The target was right in front of him. He took his finger off the trigger and did something for which his own side could have shot him dead. The official story of World War II is clean and simple. There are sides. Your side shoots. The enemy shoots back. The lines are clear. The enemy is the enemy. War demands this clarity, because without it, you cannot function in combat. But what happens when the enemy looks at you and chooses to save you instead? What happens when a man in the cockpit of a German fighter, with every reason in the world to pull the trigger, decides that some things matter more than victory? This story happened on December 20th, 1943, over Germany. Both men kept it secret for 46 years, not because they forgot, because no one would have believed them. And when they finally found each other, they became best friends for the rest of their lives. Franz Stigler was born in Bavaria in 1915. He grew up in a family that loved flying. His older brother August was a pilot, and Franz worshipped him. August wasn't just a brother. He was a hero, a role model, the person Franz measured himself against every single day. In 1939, August was killed in a flying accident. Franz was 24 years old. He channeled every ounce of his grief into one direction, becoming the best pilot he could possibly be. Not for glory, not for Germany, for August. It was the only way he knew how to carry the loss. By December 1943, that grief had turned into something formidable. 29 aerial victories, a reputation for precision and calm under pressure, the respect of his commanders, and the trust of every pilot who flew alongside him. But Stigler was not simply a machine built for war. His commanding officer was Gustav Rodel, one of the greatest aces in Luftwaffe history, with nearly 100 aerial victories, a man who had seen everything war could produce. Rodel told Stigler something once, quietly, directly, without ceremony. "If I ever find out that you shot a pilot in a parachute or finished off a crippled aircraft with a helpless crew, I will shoot you myself. We are soldiers, not murderers." Stigler never forgot those words. He had no idea, standing in front of Rodel that day, that they would one day define the most important moment of his life. Second Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown was 21 years old. He came from Weston, West Virginia, a small town, a simple upbringing. He had wanted to fly since he was a boy, and he had worked relentlessly to earn his wings. Flying wasn't a career for Brown. It was a calling. By December 1943, he was in England, commander of a B-17 flying fortress named Ye Old Pub, 379th Bombardment Group, RAF Kimbolton. December 20th, 1943 was Brown's second combat mission. His second. The target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft manufacturing plant in Bremen, deep inside German airspace, one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe. Fighters, interceptors, anti-aircraft artillery so dense it could darken the sky. Brown was 21 years old. His crew was barely older. They had trained hard and they believed in what they were doing. They had no idea that the only reason they would survive the day was a man they had been trained to consider the enemy. German fighters intercepted the American formation while it was still miles from the target. They hit hard and fast, cannon fire, coordinated attacks from multiple angles, relentless and overwhelming pressure. Ye Old Pub was struck almost immediately. The nose section was riddled with bullet holes. The oxygen system was destroyed. One engine was blown out completely. The tail section was so badly damaged that the rear of the aircraft was essentially open to the outside air, At altitude, in December, that meant temperatures of 50 degrees below zero. Men were freezing where they stood. Several crew members were killed instantly. Others were severely wounded. The tail gunner was dead at his station. The navigator had taken a bullet to the head and was barely conscious. Another crewman was being dragged across the floor of the aircraft by a man who was barely standing himself. Brown fought to hold the aircraft together. The controls responded sluggishly, reluctantly, as if the plane itself was exhausted. Speed was falling. Altitude was falling. The rest of the American formation had pressed forward and disappeared into the clouds ahead. Ye Old Pub was alone, over Germany, with dead and dying men on board. With an aircraft that by every law of physics and engineering should have broken apart over the target. And then, a German fighter dropped out of the clouds. Stigler had just landed to refuel and rearm when the call came through. A single American bomber, damaged, heading west alone. He climbed back into his cockpit and took off to intercept. He found the B-17 within minutes. He positioned himself for the attack. Standard approach, practiced hundreds of times. The target was in front of him. No escort, no evasive maneuvering, no resistance. He moved in closer to ensure a clean hit. And then he saw what was inside. Through the gaping holes torn in the fuselage, through the shattered metal and broken plexiglass, he could see the crew. Wounded men. A body slumped at a gun position. A man being dragged across the floor by another man who was barely standing. There was no combat readiness inside that aircraft. No fight left. Just human beings, broken, bleeding, dying, trying to get home. Rudel's voice came back to him. "We are soldiers, not murderers." Stigler did not fire. He did something that had no precedent in the air war over Europe. He pulled his fighter alongside the crippled bomber, wing to wing, close enough that Brown could see his face clearly through the canopy glass. Stigler looked at the young American pilot and began gesturing with his hands. "Fly north, head toward the sea, get out of German airspace." Brown didn't understand what was happening. He was certain he was about to die. His hand moved toward his sidearm, pure instinct. Then he stopped. The German wasn't attacking. He was pointing, directing. Stigler guided the shattered B-17 through corridors of German anti-aircraft artillery. The flak batteries on the ground could see them both. A German fighter flying in tight formation alongside an American bomber. They held their fire. They assumed the fighter was escorting a captured aircraft back to a German airfield. They had no idea their pilot was escorting the enemy to safety. When Ye Old Pub finally crossed the coastline and moved out over the North Sea, into airspace beyond the reach of German guns, Stigler pulled alongside the cockpit one final time. He looked at Brown. He raised his hand in a salute, and banked his fighter back toward Germany. Brown watched him disappear into the clouds, unable to speak, unable to process what had just happened. Ye Old Pub limped across the North Sea and landed at the first airfield it could find. The mechanics who examined the aircraft afterward shook their heads. The damage was catastrophic. By every structural calculation, the plane should have disintegrated over Germany. That it had flown at all, let alone crossed the North Sea, was beyond rational explanation. The crew had survived. Brown returned to his base and filed a mission report. He included everything: the German fighter, the escort through the flak zones, the gestures, the salute. He described it in precise, factual detail, because that was what a mission report required. Command read the report and classified it. The official reason? To protect morale, to prevent Allied air crews from developing the idea that German pilots might show mercy. The war required clarity. It required the enemy to be the enemy, completely, without exception. A report describing a German pilot who had escorted an American crew to safety didn't fit that clarity. The report was sealed and filed away. It would remain classified for decades. Stigler landed back at his base and said nothing to anyone. He understood the stakes. What he had done, under the laws of the Reich, was treason, assisting the enemy in wartime, a court-martial offense, a death sentence. Even years after the war ended, the weight of that secret never left him. Two men, two sides, one shared secret. For 46 years. In 1986, Charlie Brown decided to find the German pilot. He didn't know his name, didn't know if he was still alive, didn't know what country he lived in. He only knew one thing: that man had saved his crew, and that he wanted to say thank you before it was too late. Brown began reaching out. Letters to veteran organizations, to Luftwaffe pilot registries, to historical archives across Europe. He described the date, the aircraft, the mission. He asked anyone who might know anything to respond. Years passed, nothing. Then in 1989, he published a short notice in the newsletter of the American Fighter Aces Association. A few sentences describing that December morning over Germany. A request for anyone who might recognize the story. A letter arrived from Canada. A man wrote that he believed he might be the pilot Brown was looking for. He described the mission, the aircraft, the moment he moved in close and saw the crew through the holes in the fuselage. It was him. Brown picked up the phone and dialed. Stigler answered. When he heard Brown's name and understood who was calling, he began to cry. For the first time in 46 years, he could speak about it out loud. The weight he had carried since December 1943 finally had somewhere to go. They talked for hours. They met shortly after. Two old men, a former American lieutenant and a former German ace, who had faced each other in the sky over Germany nearly half a century before. They embraced like brothers. From that first phone call until the end of their lives, Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown were the closest of friends. They attended air shows together. They told their story together, to schools, to veterans groups, to anyone willing to listen. They wrote letters constantly. They called each other regularly. Their friendship lasted 18 years. They called each other the best friend they had ever made. Think about what that means. Two men who met as enemies in combat, who carried the same secret alone for 46 years, who found each other across an ocean and across a war, and spent the rest of their lives as brothers. Franz Stigler died in March 2008. He was 92 years old. Charlie Brown died in November of the same year. He was 87. 9 months apart. As if one simply didn't want to remain in the world without the other for very long. War is built on the idea that the enemy is not fully human, that they are a category, a uniform, a flag, a threat to be eliminated, rather than a person with a history and a grief and a code of their own. War demands this. You cannot function in combat if you spend your time recognizing the humanity of the man trying to kill you. But Franz Stigler looked through the holes in that fuselage and refused to stop seeing people. He could have had his 30th victory that morning, the Knight's Cross. He could have been a national hero. He chose not to be a murderer. Consider the price of that choice. No medal, no recognition, no one to tell. Just the weight of a secret carried alone for 46 years. And the very real risk of a death sentence if anyone had found out. And yet, 46 years later, that choice brought him something no medal can give. The friendship of the man he had saved. Sometimes the most courageous thing a man can do in a war is not pull the trigger. And sometimes, the enemy is the best friend you haven't met yet.